Hi, good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to give it one more minute while everybody's able to join. Well, as it is 12 o'clock and I wanted to say happy afternoon to everyone officially. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today, Spreading the Climate Crisis Message Using Advocacy in Education, sponsored by the NEHA Climate Change Committee Work Group. My name is Jenny McAdams. I'm the chair of that work group and the facilitator for the webinar. We're going to have some time today for questions at the end of this webinar. So please, if you have them throughout, put them in the Q&A box. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the welcome over to Dr. David Dijek, the Executive Director for the National Environmental Health Association, for the welcome on the call. Dr. Dijek.
Thank you, Jenny. You know, I can't believe how old I am, because I remember, and this is a true story for everyone listening in, the year was 1995. How long ago was that? Almost 30 years ago. And I got permission from a school of public health where I was working to create a new course, a course that focused on what at that time I was called global warming. I was working in California, and to make a very long story short, I described for the purpose of students from California what global warming might look like, as we described it in 95, that there would be floods complemented by droughts, complemented by more floods, and that vectors would begin to expand their territory, and that there would be all kinds of other complicated issues for public health. This was not an engineering issue. This was not an architectural issue, although certainly those are, the implications for those are there. But at its core, this was a public health issue. And here we are in 2023, and everything I talked about in 1995, Jenny, every single thing I described has come to pass. For those of you folks, and I see we have over 100, congratulations for that read the executive director's column in the NEHA Journal. You know that last year, I went to different parts of the country for just usual and customary business. These weren't special trips, Jenny. I went to Ann Arbor. I was in Sarasota, Florida. I was on Cobb Island, Maryland. I was in Denver, Colorado, and I stopped by Lyme, Connecticut. And my aim in each of those places was just to see how climate change was affecting the health, safety, and financial security of those communities. And you know what I found? Each place I visited was profoundly affected. The public's health was profoundly affected by climate change. Now, I do have videos, 90-second videos, which I haven't shared yet, which I'm anxious to do, which describe what conditions on the ground look like. I don't need to repeat the kind of news that you see in today's newspaper about climate change, about conditions along the coast and the impacts from harmful algal blooms, from drought. The Colorado River, the water is used 7 times on its way down to the Sea of Cortez, 7 times, and yet we are at historic lows there. So this is not this is bad moment. This is a profoundly challenging moment for public health. I believe that our members in the environmental health community, the profession, has a unique role, an important role in working on climate change at the local level. You know, I'm kind of famous for saying environmental health is profoundly local. And it is. And climate change impacts are profoundly local. We like to think of this as a global issue, but every community I go to is being affected by it. Our profession is like the Swiss Army knife of the public health community. We have the science background, we have the math background, we have the social skills, We understand the private sector. We understand the public sector. We understand the hospitality sector. We understand the educational sector. It is such a privilege to work at NEHA and support efforts of environmental health professionals, which are the heart and soul of the public health profession. I don't say that at the expense of any other profession within the public health paradigm, but it is absolutely true. We are the Swiss Army knife of public health, and I am proud and delighted of each of you that are participating in this panel today. I wish you Godspeed in this presentation and anything that this organization can do to help build the capacity of the individuals watching today. I want you to know, Jenny, I'll be first in line to provide that support. And with that, I'm going to bid you farewell and have a great program this afternoon Eastern time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dijek. Have a wonderful day, and thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
I'm going to introduce our speakers. And again, as a reminder, if you do have questions, please put them in the question and answer. We'll have time at the end of the call to answer some of those. Our first speaker is Doug Farquhar, who serves as the Director of Government Affairs at NEHA, which is the largest and most influential environmental health professional association in the US, dedicated solely to the practice of environmental public health. Doug is an attorney with 30 years experience working with policymakers on environmental health issues, primarily working with state legislatures. He has testified 60 times before legislative committees in 36 states, in addition to consulting with state agency staff in every state. Prior to coming to NEHA, Doug directed the Environmental Health Program for the National Conference of State Legislatures. He has worked in the Texas House of Representatives for the Natural Resources and Appropriations Committees and for Congressman Schaefer on Capitol Hill in Washington. He received his law degree from the University of Denver and undergraduate from the University of Texas in Austin. He's an adjunct professor in the University of Denver Graduate School of Environmental Policy and Management and is an affiliate professor at the University of Washington School of Public Health. Our second speaker today will be Michael Pascasilla, who was appointed as the CEO, Director of Health for the East Shore District Health Department in 2010. Michael holds a BS degree in Public Health and Nutrition from Southern Connecticut University and a master's degree in Public Health from the University of Connecticut. He is a registered sanitarian and has 30 years experience as a public health official. He is also a PhD candidate at Queen Margaret University. In addition, Michael is an adjunct professor at Southern Connecticut State University and a lecturer at Yale University in the School of Public Health, located in New Haven, Connecticut. Our third speaker today is Tracy Sabetta, who is the founding partner of Initiative Consulting, a government affairs and public relations firm located in Columbus, Ohio. Tracy has nearly 30 years of experience working in government, politics, and communications in Ohio, with a current focus on healthcare, environmental, and energy policy at the local, state, and federal levels. Prior to starting Initiative Consulting in 2008, she served as the Vice President of Government Relations for the American Cancer Society, where she was the campaign co-chair and media spokesperson for the successful Smoke-Free Ohio statewide ballot initiative campaign that made all workplaces in Ohio smoke-free. Tracy has also served as a legislative and policy staff member in both the Ohio Senate and House of Representatives, and has worked as a campaign manager and staff in the U.S. Senate, Ohio gubernatorial, legislative, and issue campaigns across the state. Tracy is a native of Ashtabula, Ohio, and a graduate of Miami University in Oxford. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Doug.
Thank you very much, Jenny. I appreciate that. Next slide, please. If the slides are up. 5 stages of environmental health policy. Just want to remind everybody that the picture here is Godzilla taking on the smog monster. Smog monster was a severe one of the foes of Godzilla and the many Godzilla movies that have been out there, and I like to use it as a good representation of what we're doing. Smog monster represents climate change, represents the battle we are taking on, and we represent Godzilla. All of us involved in environmental health that are actively taking on climate change and that are actually trying to make the world a better place and a safer place. We are environmental health Godzillas, and I want everybody to think about that as we go on through the fight. And my fight is with environmental health policy. And these are what I have to generally go through when I ever go into any policymaker's office to talk about any new issue that we're dealing with. And first of all, it's always denial. Second one, anger. Third one, bargaining. Fourth one, depression. Fifth one, acceptance. And each of these quotes have been told to me by different representatives, different legislators across the country, and they all have the same attitude, which is they want to reject it. Okay, is this actually an issue? Is this something we have to deal with? Is this something we can negotiate out of? You know, is there any answer to this that we have to deal with? But finally, after going through all these things, they do come to the realization we have to do this. They will accept and move on. Next slide, please. This slide I really like to use quite a bit because it expresses the notion that we're dealing with when we're dealing with environmental health policy in this country. We've got all these federal agencies out there that are doing all these different things, and they're making activities work at the federal level. But when it comes to environmental health, you're really dealing with EPA. And if you look at how EPA operates, it has everything done by the state and local level. EPA does very little outside, provide guidance for state and local to implement environmental health policy. So climate change is only going to be addressed at the state and local level. The federal government, the CDC, the EPA have very little authority, very little capability to get environmental health policy done and to get climate change done. It has to be done by the states and by mostly the local jurisdictions. Next slide, please. 10th Amendment. This is something that we don't ever respect enough in this country, but there is a 10th Amendment, the last of the original Bill of Rights, where James Madison said the power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states or the people. The word environment does not appear in the Constitution. The word public health does not appear in the Constitution. This means all environmental health policy is implemented by the states. There is no constitutional right to environmental health. There is no constitutional right, nor any federal right to deal with climate change. This is something we're going to have to do. So how do you deal with policymakers? Next slide, please. Well, policymakers, they respond to problems. These are some things that we've been hearing about recently. And the important thing with all of this, none of this is being answered by the federal government. The problem that occurred in Flint, that was done by the state of Michigan, by the local water district, and it was solved, it was addressed by Genesee Public Health. They were the ones that first came forward and saying, hey, we're seeing elevated levels of lead in the kid, and it's coming from the water. This was this was absolutely a local issue. Industries addressing all the hazardous substances that they put out, that is getting responded to by state and local environmental health officials. Chemicals going through cities, PFAS, all these major issues we're talking about, they are getting addressed by the state and local, which means state and local policymakers are being forced to deal with this. And it doesn't matter which party are they. You know, people tend to say, well, we need to deal with the Republicans, or we need to deal with the Democrats because they're the ones that are going to take action on it. If you have a PFAS outbreak, which generally happens in rural areas because it's going into drinking water, which is going into private wells, that is an issue of Republicans. Rural areas are covered by Republicans. They are the ones that are really making the biggest stink about this. If you take a look about who is making the most dramatic issues out there regarding PFAS, it is the Republican policymakers. Next slide, please. So how do you get their attention? How do you deal with them? Well, you highlight a crisis. You say, we're going to have a crisis down here. We're going to be dealing with a problem now or soon. You deal with a higher moral authority. You have a celebrity spokesperson talk about this. These are all ways that can be done. But the way that I have found the environmental health community has been most effective was providing better public policy. Argue the facts, argue that we can provide a more effective response to policymaking, that the cost to respond to an environmental health disaster like Hurricane Katrina or the wildfires in the West are public health mitigation process. It's more economically viable, it's more state and local resource viable. It takes much less investment to deal with the problem before it occurs than afterwards. So that brings us to climate change. Next slide, please. Americans are becoming more concerned about climate change. The talks we have had over the many years is starting to take effect. Americans take a high priority on their health. They are recognizing that the environment is a huge contributor to their health. So therefore, they're very much becoming in agreement that we need to make sure that a cleaner air leads to less adverse health effects. And it would be smart for us to start addressing it. And probably the foremost way we're seeing that is the next slide with extreme weather. We are seeing this very much occurring. We're, in the past, essentially, if you take a place like Pensacola, Florida, they saw one hurricane between 1960 and 1990. Since then, they've seen 28. Hurricanes are becoming common in this country. Intensity of the storms are becoming more so. Wildfires are becoming more of an issue. This is something we didn't have to deal with 20, 30 years ago, but it's something that's becoming face-to-face that we have to deal with. Therefore, policymakers have to deal with it. The way we should respond to it is really within the next slide there, talking about the facts, talking about how we can address this. There are ways for us to deal with climate change that more so than it is an issue that is unanswerable, something that we can't address. Climate change is something that we definitely can address. If we can move to the next couple slides here. Next one. There we go. How do we advocate with policymakers? The way you do this is something that I have talked to my environmental health community often. Reach out to them. Do not be afraid of them. The state and local policymakers are eager to hear your voice. There's somebody you want to hear talk. There are people that want to talk to you. Visiting. Sign on to letters, attend candidate forums. One of the things I often tell audiences is you will never meet the president. You will rarely meet your US senator, but you can reach out to your state senator. This is somebody you can have a cup of coffee with. You can talk to your public board of health. You can talk to your county commissioners. You should do that. Next slide, please. What is policymaking? I'm going to go through the next set of slides pretty quick here, but even though it's complex, it is not without logic. It takes effort to get involved with the legislative process, but the legislative process is welcoming. They want to hear from you. Legislators are hearing from a broad variety of people, diverse issues, diverse responses. They take broad input. You're not going to be the only issue on the table. You can provide either money, votes, or information. The only part that the environmental health community can provide is good data, good information. Use it. That is going to be your strongest point. Mind you that we got about 175,000 bills out there. Only about 10% of them become enacted on each session, but we are seeing wins out there on climate change. Next slide, please. We saw in the past few years 67 bills dealing with climate change. Texas introduced a bill on greenhouse gas emission. Iowa introduced a bill. Mississippi introduced a bill. This is an issue that is affecting every aspect of this country, every part of this country, and something that policymakers are looking to seeing responses with. Next slide, please. We don't need to go into this because we know what the Biden administration is doing. Next slide. This is what NEHA is doing. We have had climate, we have a policy statement on climate change. We've been writing letters to Congress regarding climate change. We have written letters directly to the administration about climate change and how environmental health is an important point of it. We have sent letters to CDC and EPA, and we're going to be participating in Climate Change Lobby Week on March 22nd this year. So NEHA is very much engaged in this. The next two slides I'm going to hold off because it's something that deals with general issues. But at this point, I really would like to turn it back over to Jenny to turn on to the next speaker. But finally, back one, we are all environmental health Godzillas. Don't forget the power that each one of you have. With that, I'd like to turn it back over to Jenny.
Thank you so much, Doug. Wonderful presentations and a good reminder of how strong we all are together. I'm going to actually turn it over now to Mike.
Thank you, Jenny and Doug. Yes, we are all Godzillas. I like that. I got to remember that one. So again, Michael Pascasilla. I've been in environmental health for 30 years now, and climate change is important to me, not just professionally, but personally. I grew up on the shoreline and I'm seeing the changes, getting impact every single day, and trying to do what I can. Next slide. And so I guess the first thing that I will say is, if I have learned anything, it is advocacy matters. We do have a voice, especially in numbers. It's our profession, our communities. We know what's best for environmental health and public health in our communities. And if we don't step up, then who will? Next slide. Put this slide in, the power of us. And first we have to acknowledge, and Doug, you went over a bit, is that, there's local, state, and national, and we all have a role, but we also have different responsibilities, and we have to acknowledge that. And so I'm at the local level, although I've done stuff at the state and national level, and I sit on a couple of national committees. And so as a local public health professional, things start local and end local, and you really can make a difference. Next slide. So I want to go back to my roots real quick. I started off as a sanitarian, and I got to put a shout out to the Connecticut Environmental Health Association, where I learned advocacy. And then it evolved to the Connecticut Directors of Health Association, along with the Connecticut Public Health Association, where we all have worked together. And we've done testimony, we've put scripts together. We've gotten to know our legislators. And it's important because one of the things that I learned throughout my career as a public health, environmental health official, is sometimes we know what needs to happen. And sometimes we look at these laws and the laws don't always make sense, but the laws can be changed. And we can do that. And, we've been very successful doing that, but it's a process and you have to understand the process. Many times in environmental health, we're more reactive than proactive. And sometimes that's just the way it is. But the more proactive we can be, the better off we are. When we talk about climate change, we really need, we're in reactive mode, but we need to take things to the next step in a short order. And so one of the bullets here is, if not, then who? Who is going to advocate better for environmental public health than us? And I would go as far as saying is one of the single most important things that we do in environmental health is advocacy. In fact, when we survey our members, that is the most important thing that we consistently get back. We are the voice, collectively working with our partners. Next slide. And so your voice matters, especially, whether it's for your agency or professional association. You can't do something if you've never done it. You have to try. Sometimes that takes risk. Advocacy, again, is a key function of what we do if we want change. And I have to encourage everybody out there, regardless of what position you are in, you need to be involved. Whether it's through NEHA, whether it's through your state affiliation, because you can make a change, and that change is done through collaboration. Next slide. And so again, join your local affiliation, get to know your state representatives. And if I could just quickly take you through the process, right? Because I've done, along with my colleagues, we've done testimony, we put scripts together, we do the education side of the house with our legislators, and you need to get to know them. They're people just like us. There are times when some of my legislators call me up and ask me questions. And so you need that relationship, and they're people, they have roles, they have lots of pressure. And so if you could clearly articulate what you want to change ahead of time, a lot of this stuff happens behind the scene. Here in Connecticut, the Connecticut Association of Directors of Health, we have a lobbyist that we work with, but collectively and separately, we work with our local representatives. So when the time comes to make a change, we have a script, we know what we want to say. And a lot of the work with changing legislation or creating legislation is behind the scenes, and relationships matter. And education to stakeholders, you have to do that. That's part of it. Advocacy and education, they're different, but they are closely related in the sense that you need to educate the powers that be, what the issues are, and then you need to have that voice, and you need to lobby and advocate for yourself and for your profession. Next slide. And so if I could just quickly talk about some personal, my experience and what we've done. We've advocated, again, through local organizations like the Connecticut Directors of Health Association and CIHA, where we have a Environmental Professionals Day. That was something that was recently done by the Connecticut Association. Get recognized as a profession, and a proclamation from the governor. Some of the things that we've done is we've advocated for more funding locally, and we've gotten more funding locally. And it was a process, but we've done that. On food safety side of the house, I'm an advocate for food allergens. I have, on the personal side, it impacts me, but on the professional side, we needed to do more. And so I got involved, and I understood the process, which took me all the way to the Conference for Food Protection, where I'm an executive board member. And for those of you who want to change food policy, that is a process. And it took me decades to understand, and to get to that place where if you want to change, in this case, we're talking about climate change, you have to understand the process. There are, and Doug outlined it a bit, there are rules of engagement when it comes to changing laws and doing advocacy. And it starts by getting involved, understanding the process. And what your ask is. Of course, we want more funding and resources, but we need to justify that. No one's just going to give it to us. We need to fight for it. We need to advocate for ourselves. And so if you walk away with anything from this presentation, get involved. It doesn't matter if you're just starting or if you've been in the profession for the last 30 years. Get involved, get to know your legislators through organizations like your state affiliations, through NEHA. You really can make a difference. I promise you can make a difference. I know I have, but again, none of us do it in a vacuum. We need to do it together. And right now we are facing the biggest challenge that any of us will ever have, and that's climate change. And we need to work together and talk to our representatives and start making some change. And so with that, I will turn it over back to Jenny. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Our next speaker is Tracy Sabetta. I'm going to turn it over to you, Tracy.
Thank you so much. I will say you're probably going to see at least a little bit of repetition in some of what I'm going to say, but I think that just proves that we all have had very similar experiences when it comes to advocacy around public health. As Jenny mentioned, I did spend about 17 years working in a variety of capacities with the American Cancer Society. And then in 2008, I had the pleasure of being introduced to the environmental community through some of the work that I was doing. And one thing that was very important to me was that I noticed the public health community in Ohio was not as engaged in environmental advocacy and activism as they should have been. And so one of my roles, at least what I took on as one of my roles, was trying to change that, working in partnership with groups like the Association of Ohio Health Commissioners, working with Jenny at the Ohio Public Health Association and others to really try to make sure that the message was spread through the public health community. And what I'm hoping I can do with the presentation today is give you a few examples of ways in which that has been successful and effective, and things that I'm hoping that you would be willing to do as well. Next slide. So first off, why do we advocate? And I pulled this directly off the American Public Health Association website so that you could see that this is something that your colleagues have embraced and are encouraging as well. And being an advocate can have far-reaching positive impacts on the public's health by providing policymakers with the information they need to make decisions and in turn influence legislation. While the legislative process can be long and complex, effective advocacy does not have to be. So we've talked a little bit about the difference between advocacy and lobbying. I know that there are a lot of questions and a lot of hesitancy around the idea of lobbying legislators, both at the local, state, and federal levels. And I'm hoping what we can talk about a little bit today is the difference between advocacy and lobbying, and how advocacy can be every bit as much as important and effective as straight out lobbying. Next slide. So why do we advocate? First and foremost, no matter if you're advocating or lobbying, it's to educate and inform, and also to influence. We are the providers of information that lawmakers do not have. I mean, think about being a freshman lawmaker in any state or in Congress at the federal level and realizing the amount of information that's going to be given to you, the kind of decisions you're going to be asked to make immediately. Are you a transportation specialist? Are you an insurance specialist? Are you an education specialist? You cannot be a specialist in everything. So that is the role that advocates can play. We can be those experts. We can be the specialists. We can summarize the information, give them the really important portions and what it is that they need to know to make those decisions. And that will be a critical role for public health advocates. Yes, we want to influence because we want them to take the steps that we support and that we know is good for public health in our states and across the country. So we do want to influence. That is a very important piece, but we want to drive ideas. We want to give them ideas. What is it that they can do at the state level? As Doug mentioned, climate action is local, which I think is very true, but a lot of decisions also come from the state and federal level that make it possible for those local decision makers to take action. We want to preserve what we have. If your state has funding for climate action, they have incentives for clean energy. We want to make sure that those things are not lost. And we also want to establish relationships. We want to be seen as the specialists. We want to be seen as those experts. We want the legislative staff or the members to pick up the phone and call us because we have the answers that they're looking for. There's a picture on this slide, and this was taken in Charleston, West Virginia in 2017 before an EPA hearing on the Clean Power Plan. And we have public health experts who are among the group there that came to talk with credibility about the need to clean up the air in our nation. Next slide. So does it make a difference? Sometimes it does not feel like it does, but I guarantee you that it does. And this actually paraphrases a little bit on something that Doug said. It's one of my favorite sayings is you can bring the money or you can bring the pain. And very few of us are able to bring the money because law prohibits us from doing that in our official capacities, but we can bring the pain. And in this particular case, the pain is people and the pain is information. We are bringing information that oftentimes cannot be disputed. We are bringing the credibility that cannot be disputed. The public health argument is one that is very hard for legislators to counter effectively. They can counter job growth numbers and say that you're making those up, or they can counter budget numbers. But to say that there are nearly 200,000 children in your state that have asthma and are suffering as a result of air pollution in the state, there's really nothing that they can say to counter those numbers. This is data. This is public health expertise, and this is what you bring that a lot of other people cannot bring. And one of the worst experiences is don't let anyone ever say that they didn't hear from you. I would say this was probably back in 2008. So this has stuck with me for a very long time. And I was just starting to work on some federal climate change legislation at the time. And I happened to have an encounter with Senator Sherrod Brown, the U.S. Senator, one of the U.S. senators from Ohio. And there were people out there holding up signs about healthcare because healthcare reform debate was going on. And there were some other things too. And we had a small group that was holding up signs about climate change and air pollution and green energy jobs. And he came over to us and said, I have been touring the state on my recess here, and I hear about healthcare constantly. I hear about insurance constantly. You are the first group that I have seen talking about climate change and talking about clean energy. And, no, I'm not hearing from anybody else. And I swore to myself at that moment that I would never again let an elected official say that to me about an issue that I was working on. Don't ever let them say that they didn't hear from you, because that tells them that you don't care or that you don't have the information to share with them. Next slide. So what can you do? You've heard a little bit about this already, but introduce the right person to new lawmakers at the state and federal level. Get in before those lawmakers have had a chance to hear from a million other people. They will remember some of what they hear first, oftentimes what they hear last too, depending on your lawmaker. But if you establish yourself as the resource and you establish your information as credible right off the bat, they will be comparing everything else that they hear to the standard that you set. So getting to know those lawmakers early and establishing those relationships is critical. And if you can't get in to see your lawmaker, staff is absolutely fine. There is no reason in the world not to meet with legislative staff. A lot of times they will synthesize the information for the lawmaker. They will provide the recommendations that the lawmaker will then review, but there is no problem getting to know legislative staff. They are your entrance point to that lawmaker. And don't be afraid of meeting your lawmakers and your public officials at any level. Local ones are your friends and neighbors. So that's a much easier one to do. But really, do not be intimidated by the idea of meeting them. Back in 1993, boy, am I really dating myself with some of these stories. But in 1993, I had just started working at the State House, and my husband and I had taken my nephew to see the official Christmas tree lighting ceremony at the State House. It was absolutely beautiful. I was so excited. I was fresh out of college. I was working in the State House. I thought that this was going to be the end all be all for me. And as I'm walking through the atrium of our State House, my husband is pushing the baby carriage and he runs over the man that's standing in front of us. He was too busy looking at other things and literally just took out the ankles of Governor George Voinovich, who happened to be in front of us in this. And here is a man who didn't necessarily agree with on a lot of ideological points, but he turned around and was so kind and so gracious and just played with the baby. And I think that was the moment that I realized these are people. These are people who want to do the right thing. Even if we don't always think it's the right thing, they believe that it is, and they want to do the right thing, and they are open to hearing from us in most cases. Other things that you can do is hold informational briefings for lawmakers that are on relevant committees. Oftentimes that's going to be public health and financing. Briefings are advocacy. Even if you're not making a specific ask on a piece of legislation, you are giving information that they can then use to help them make those decisions. Provide them with new studies and annual reports. You can see this graphic here. It's a study on air pollution. I mean, this is the data that they're not going to get from a lot of other sources. And give them information on potential policies before they're even introduced. It is not lobbying if there is no bill that is pending. If you're talking to them about what needs to happen, you're advocating for a concept and not for a specific piece of legislation. Next slide. Other things that you're able to do, and obviously I am talking a little bit from Ohio perspective, so I would always check with your particular state laws on lobbying and what your agency is comfortable with, but oftentimes testifying on policy that is mission critical is allowed in most states. If this is to protect your funding or something that your agency was literally designed to do as part of its mission, this is something that you should look into offering testimony on. You can also offer testimony on a piece of legislation as an interested party. That way you are not asking them to say yes or no to a piece of legislation. You are providing information to help them make their decisions. You can also author an op-ed as an expert. You know, this is something that I know newspapers in Ohio are always very interested in. I'm assuming it is similar in other states, but you can talk about a position without taking a position on legislation. For example, here's a Columbus Dispatch headline: politicians have put interests of oil, gas industries before Ohioans in parks. That headline was obviously not written by the advocate necessarily. Those are usually written by the editorial staff, but this particular op-ed was written by someone who has a public health slant on it's the fracking and build out of the natural gas industry. There was a bill that was pending at the end of the General Assembly in Ohio last year, but she does not reference that particular bill. She only references the issue itself. Next slide, please. And this is something that I believe Michael mentioned too, but what else can you do? Join groups and coalitions and offer your expertise. There might be others in that group who are going to then go out and lobby on a particular piece of legislation, but you can provide them with information, especially if it's public information. They can then take it to those lawmakers and use it to advocate. One thing that I have been working on with Moms Clean Air Force quite a bit over the last 6 to 8 months is the electric school bus program, the clean school bus program that's being funded through the US EPA and the infrastructure packages. And I am always happy to talk about this more at another time if folks are interested, but this is a program where funding was provided for cleaner school buses, whether it be electric, propane, or compressed natural gas in all 50 states. And the US EPA is trying to form statewide coalitions in every state to focus specifically on expanding information about electric school buses and then also increasing the number of school districts that apply. So this is a place that would make a lot of sense. In fact, the Ohio EPA and the Ohio Department of Health have pulled the stakeholders together in Ohio. They are taking the lead, and this would be a very appropriate place for you to get involved in changing policy without lobbying. You can also host panel discussions and virtual convenings to share that information. You'll see right there, there's a graphic of shaping the future of air quality. This was something that our Cleveland Public Health Air Quality Department participated in and talked a lot about the new air quality monitoring grant that was received from the US EPA. So talking again about trying to change policy without lobbying a particular piece of legislation, and then thank legislators for action that they've already taken. The American Public Health Association has a Distinguished Public Health Legislator of the Year award. This is something you could replicate at the state and local level. Next slide, please. This is one example. Just show up. If you show up to something, you learn more about the issue, people will see you there and they can ask you questions. In this particular picture, it was a rally for clean energy support, and there are representatives there from the state, local, state, and federal levels. I'm not going to go through, but the governor is there, staff from Sherrod Brown's office is there, and Franklin County commissioners are there as well. And so it was a great opportunity to build camaraderie and learn about an issue. Next slide, please. But what can you do on your own time as well? Because this is every bit as important. You can make phone calls to your lawmakers and do letters and emails in support or opposition of particular pieces of legislation. You can write letters to the editor of your local paper, and social media is such an incredible tool to use. As you see here, Peggy Berry, who is actually one of our sort of premier public health advocates in Ohio, she was writing letters to the editor and tagging her state senator to let him know that this was action that she was taking. You can see over there's, this is one that I actually posted through Moms Clean Air Force, tagging Congresswoman Beatty. We wanted the Build Back Better plan to pass. We wanted to see infrastructure plans funded. So, you know, we held up signs, we tag individual members of Congress and the state legislator. And this is definitely something that gets right back through to them. It expands the reach of your audience, and it is something that you can do on your own time. Next slide, please. Stay informed and up to date. Learn what's going on in your state and in your city. Subscribe to newsletters and newspapers. Google alerts are fantastic. You can get those delivered to your email every single day. Just type in a few things that you're interested in, and if it appears in papers in your state, it will come right to your email. And again, you know, use social media as that tool. This is something that I preach all day long. It is something that lawmakers and reporters pay a lot of attention to. NEHA actually has a Twitter page. It's over there in the corner. If you're not following it, you can follow it and find out more about what NEHA is doing. And again, talk to your friends and neighbors because they see you as an expert as well. Next slide. Just a couple of quick examples. I don't want to take up too much more time, but recently the US EPA issued a supplemental methane rule to change the way that existing and new oil and gas wells are treated. It talks about plugging some of the leaks and taking care of abandoned wells. I'm not going to go into specifics about that, but this is a great opportunity to speak with a public health voice. This is not a legislative decision. This is a rule that would be decided by the EPA, and bringing that public health credibility to this issue makes a lot of difference. And you can share photos of yourself doing this on social media. You could issue a press release that your agency has taken this step, and you can write a letter to the editor about your experience. Next slide, please. And what can you do right now? If you have not yet done so, reach out to your lawmakers. In a lot of states, I think probably in most states, session has just started, and you have a bunch of new lawmakers who know nothing about you and know nothing about what you do and what your agency stands for. This is the time to meet them. This is the time to make sure that that happens. Identify a coalition where you can offer that expertise. We talked a little bit about the Clean School Bus Program. There are plenty of others as well in all of the states. And if you're interested in advocating on US EPA rules, the soot rule actually was filed at the very end of last week, and they are taking signups for testimony now. Next slide, please. And this is I guess the citations on here. It's an Edmund Burke quote. He was a member of the British Parliament back in the 1700s. Not something somebody I would ever think I'd share a quote with, but this is something that rattles around in my head all the time. Nobody makes a greater mistake than he who does nothing because he could do only a little. We can all only do a little when it comes to solving climate change and to reducing the impacts of climate change. But that does not mean that we should not do everything that we can. And advocating on public health will be one of the most empowering experiences that you can ever have. And you should use your expertise and your resources to make sure that you are making a difference. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tracy. Thank you to all of our speakers. That was a very helpful, very empowering presentation, and I think we've all gotten a lot out of it. I'm really excited to read through some of these questions. I think that these are really going to help clarify and just raise the attention a little bit more of what we're doing. So I'm going to read through some of these while we still have time. And certainly if you can, or if you have any other questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A, and we'll certainly have this recording available at NEHA's website as well. So my first question is to all of you, actually. When dealing with your local or state legislator, how do you handle the misinformation or some of the denial they may have? So as you're delivering those importance of climate impacts and public health impacts, how do you handle that misinformation, that denial, that pushback?
I would simply say, first point, be cautious about that in the sense that you do have the facts on your side. Use the facts, use the data. use the public health information, but don't try to get into a situation. If you have a legislator who is not behind it, don't try to, twist their arm or anything, because you're not. You're not going to be able to change their mind, but you need to be able to provide that you are able to provide solid information, you're able to provide the facts, and be seen as a good subject matter expert.
Yes, if I could just add to that, I would agree, Doug, you never want to get into a back and forth situation because you're not going to get anywhere. However, let the data speak for itself in the research. But then the other thing that we find to be very compelling is if you have visuals and pictures and more local examples. So if you're arguing climate change, say here on the East Coast, we don't talk about things that are happening in Alaska. That's very important. Hands down, I don't want to take it away, but they're going to connect better if it's happening in your hometown or something that they know about. And so you have to be very strategic in your messaging about getting your point across. And in some ways, it's about debating, right? Because you're debating. It's a healthy debate, maybe even a clash of intelligent minds. That's okay, but you got to get your facts straight. And the more you could bring it back locally, where they could connect, you're more likely to get better results.
Thank you so much. Tracy, can you talk a little bit more about the difference in semantics between lobbying and advocacy?
Sure. It is a little bit more, runs a little more deeply than just semantics on this. And I am not going to claim to be an IRS expert on lobbying, although I have definitely been trained on more than one occasion. But it boils down very, very easily to whether or not you're taking a position on a specific piece of legislation. Are you asking a lawmaker to vote yes or no on a piece of legislation, up or down? It really is just a question. You're making an ask for a particular decision. And if you're advocating, you are supporting or opposing a position or a concept. You are providing information that has to do with something that could be considered. Maybe it is being considered or it could be considered. And you are acting as an expert, but you are not standing up saying, on behalf of this public health agency, we want you to vote yes on House Bill 123. That is when you start to cross the line.
Thank you so much. I know that's very helpful. For those folks at NEHA, is there any more information that can be given on the Climate Change Lobby Week?
The Climate Change Lobby Week, which I discussed there, this is being pushed by another association, but they have reached out to me saying, will NEHA participate? And I said, yes. We have a policy statement on this. I am I'm very specific about the policy statements because that is what we can say that our board has said is the truth and we can move forward with. But it's going to be a series of events where we're going to be talking to members of Congress about climate change and the importance of climate change and environmental health, how it impacts environment.
Thank you. For anybody, can you talk a little bit more about the role of environmental health practitioners in regards to climate change mitigation? One person on the call has staff that's not allowed to lobby while private businesses can, which we discussed. So how do environmental health professionals fill their way into this climate change world?
I'm going to have to bring one point up and I'll let the others speak about it in more detail. But one of the biggest complaints I received from policymakers, from state legislators especially, is the fact that they never hear from the state, environmental health community. They never hear from the people in the state agencies or the local agencies. They won't talk to them. They will hear from the lobbyists, they hear from the advocacy, but they never hear from their actual state person. And it's because of these lobbying bans. Oh, I'm not allowed. They've even said, hey, I've called out and left messages, or it's left emails on this person in a state agency and he's never called me back. Well, it's because they're not allowed to, and we really have a disservice here. I don't know the easy way to get around that. But I do want to let people know that the policymakers want to hear from you. They're desperate to hear from you because at the state and local level, the staff are the ones who are going to know how we're going to actually implement this or not.
Yeah, just to add to that, what I have found is at the state level, a lot of state employees are not allowed to testify. And if they do testify, typically it's agency related. There's many layers that they have to go through and permissions. And so, you know, at the local level, we do have some of that. But what I find is through your professional organizations, they are connected, but they have a voice. And so going through that process, a few things that I've learned, and I meant to bring this up through the advocacy process through our lobbyists, is it's a negotiation. There are no lines in the sand. Like you can't, it's almost like those of you who've been involved in union negotiations, there has to be a give and take. What our lobbyist talks about is an escape hatch, right? So this is what you want, but it may be a process. This year you get this, next year you get that. And sometimes it's a long-term strategy versus a short-term strategy. And that's where you have to really work with your professional associations. I think they, and through their connections, have more of a voice than sometimes state and local agencies, because sometimes issues are so charged that as a government official, you can be locked up a bit or tied up a bit. So that's why I think the associations and organizations like your state affiliations and other groups, including NEHA and others, that's where you can really make a difference.
Does NEHA have climate fact sheets that can be used during Hill visits?
Sorry, that didn't get on mind. We have, the short answer is yes, we have policy statements. They are found, we have a policy statement that is found online, but we also have fact sheets, and we also have access to other groups out there, like the Climate Action Network and the American Lung Association, which have excellent resources that they can provide. Our angle is very much environmental health. Their angle with the Lung Association is with lung. Climate Action Network has different angles, but each one of them are important, and please do not negate those issues, those elements when you're moving forward.
Great, thank you. And I know we've just got a couple more minutes here. So my last question is there anything at the federal level, any legislation that that anybody on the call should be aware of that's coming down that they can start using some of these advocacy tools for?
Go ahead, Tracy, please.
Oh, no, I was just going to say right now, I know for those of us who are working on some federal legislation, it's really the implementation of the infrastructure, the funding that is coming through the infrastructure packages for climate change. I mean, there is a lot. There are clean energy incentives. There are, as we mentioned, the air quality monitoring grants, the clean school bus program. I mean, there are a variety of different climate related pieces of those packages, and we need to make sure that there are no obstacles at the state level to making sure that that funding gets into the local communities, into groups who are actually doing this work. So that is a big one, and then the EPA rules on methane and soot are two others.
Well, with that, I know we're at 1 o'clock. I want to thank our guests today, Michael, Tracy, Doug, and thank you to NEHA and Dr. Dijek for hosting this. I hope everybody got what they needed from this and at least started that conversation either with your departments or even with yourself on what to do next. So please feel free to reach out to us if you have any further questions. As I mentioned, this will be on the NEHA website for perusal later, and I'm sure we'll send out the link as well. Thank you all again and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.